nothing more than to raise taxes and increase spending so they can keep buying stuff, that stuff being votes, and peddling their influence. His next statement is he talks about joining his colleagues in the House in an effort to protect as many Americans as possible from a tax increase. Well, while that may be true to an extent, because they did keep the folks that were earning $400,000 or less from having the Bush-era tax cuts that had been put in place then sunset, and an additional $2,000 a year roughly for those folks being tacked in. There are still taxes that everybody who's working is going to end up paying because, as we kind of touched on yesterday, and we'll do a little more today, part of what happened is the tax that you pay that funds Social Security, they call it the payroll tax, it went up by 2%. I mean, that's in effect. So your check's going to get smaller. He also said that the American people chose divided government. Well, not everybody did. I've lamented often at this point that it's obvious that the presidential election was stolen. So I think the people chose a conservative president. Not that Romney necessarily would have been as conservative as necessary, but still would have been better than a Marxist who has no interest whatsoever in doing anything but continuing to build his own empire. He made the statement that it's unfortunate that Obama insisted on taking more from hardworking taxpayers. And yes, that's true, but I'm sure he would have been much happier going ahead and getting taxes from anybody making more than $35,000 a year. Forget the $250,000 mark. Eventually, those people will be targeted to help pay for things. I mean, those people have already been targeted. Payroll tax and, well, Obamacare. Obamacare is huge. It's going to hit a lot of people. If it hasn't already got you, it's going to get you. Probably still in ways that may even be disguised so that you don't necessarily see it coming. Now, again, he does have several good points when he makes the statements about how elected officials do have a duty to apply principles to the realities of governing. That they have to exercise prudence. There's still some question as to whether or not there was any prudence involved in voting for this. But in weighing the benefits and the cost of action or inaction, when it comes to H.R. 8, I'm still not sure that things are really better with it than without it. I'm convinced that this really was nothing more than political theater. They're wanting you to look over here at the left hand as they're waving and doing whatever, while the right hand is still digging, covering up the big hole that they're trying to bury the Benghazi scandal in. There should be movement forward with an effort at impeachment over Benghazi. But the House isn't going to bother with that because right now they're too busy trying to negotiate away the rest of whatever it is that they think they can take from the American people before there is actually a revolt. Not that making that effort would do any good at all anyway, because what happens? Well, for those of you who aren't familiar with the process, the House Judiciary Committee looks at the evidence. They make a determination whether or not to proceed. If they decide to proceed, it goes to the floor of the House and they vote whether or not to impeach. If they vote to impeach, then the Senate holds a trial, and, well, is it very likely that the strongly democratically controlled Senate would find him guilty. I mean, given the way Harry Reid's acted over the last, 7.5, 8 years now, I doubt he'd even allow it to come to the floor. He'd find some procedural thing or change some procedural rule, I'm sure. At any rate, it's still disappointing to hear somebody as smart and knowledgeable as Paul Ryan basically capitulate and move forward. Already touched on it a little bit, but just in case you missed it, just in case you didn't realize it, you got a ton of bosses out here today telling their employees, don't blame us when your checks get smaller starting with your next payroll, because those payroll taxes rose to 6.2%. Everybody's paycheck is about to take a hit, and it's not just the boss's fault. It's not the boss's fault at all. Some business owners are already complaining that it's a pretty tough talk to have with their employees, especially the ones that are earning relatively low wages to begin with. The rate of workers' payroll taxes, which go to fund Social Security, has been 4.2% for the past 2 years. As of the first, though, it was back to 6.2%. At least on the first $113,700 in wages you earn. It gets a little higher when you earn more than that. Payroll taxes are the key for financing Social Security, and the break of the past 2 years has forced the government to replenish the funds with, surprise, surprise, borrowed money. The tax break was always meant to be temporary. Also, no surprise. Workers earning the national average salary of $41,000 will receive $32 less on every biweekly paycheck. The higher the salary, up to $113,700, the bigger the bite. But businesses and business owners say that their lower wage employees will feel it the most. House Speaker John Boehner couldn't hold back when he spotted Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid in the White House lobby last Friday, by the way. It was only a few days before the nation could go over the fiscal cliff. No bipartisan agreement was in sight, and Reid had just publicly accused Boehner of running a dictatorship in the House and caring more about holding on to his gavel than striking a deal. Well, Boehner had heard about that, and as you can imagine, he had a reaction. For those of you who hadn't heard this, this was flying everywhere, all over Twitter, Facebook, and every political reporting news website, magazine, and probably all over the mainstream media as well. Boehner told him to go F yourself. Boehner sniped as he pointed his finger at Reid, according to multiple sources. Reid was a bit startled and asked, "What are you talking about?" And Boehner just repeated himself, "Go F yourself." Evidently, the harsh exchange was just a few steps away from the Oval Office, which Boehner later bragged about to fellow Republicans, and was only one episode in nearly 2 months of the high-stakes negotiations, aka political theater, laced with distrust, miscommunications, false starts, and yelling matches as Washington struggled to ward off $500 billion in tax hikes and spending cuts. Boehner was taking it from all sides, but as we also found out, if you were paying attention to certain news articles today, the White House, aka the occupier, sent over a note to Harry Reid with suggestions on things to give up in the negotiations. Harry Reid supposedly just took this note and threw it into his fireplace, which he has a tendency of keeping lit, especially this time of year. Supposedly, according to several aides, he has a habit of throwing a lot of suggestions into that fireplace, so obviously that's what Harry Reid thinks about anybody making suggestions for how he should do his job. Evidently, between the complete disregard for the occupier and his notes and the go F yourself statements from Boehner, that's tends to be the real reason why Mr. Joe Biden was sent to do the negotiating in the Senate, and Harry Reid was set to stand aside and let the big boys do what the big boys do, I guess. Harry Reid was just towing the line, and Obama evidently felt like the line wasn't being productive enough. Hard to say exactly to what extent this played into everything, but this is still part of the intrigue and the drama that has been this political theater. Again, look over here, look over here. See my right hand? See my right hand? Don't look at the left. Don't look at my left hand. The White House also claimed today that supposedly this deal cuts $737 billion from the deficit. Not sure how it really cuts anything from the deficit, since it doesn't do any end to deficit spending. But at any rate, the acting White House budget director wrote in a blog post that the current law baseline, which the Congressional Budget Office used Tuesday to conclude that the deal approved by Congress would add $4 trillion to the debt over 10 years, is not realistic. Quote, the relevant point of comparison isn't current law, it's current policy. Those policies that were in place on December 31st, the day before all the changes were scheduled to take effect. The current law baseline assumes that all the Bush tax cuts would expire on schedule at the end of 2012, something neither party wanted to see happen. It also assumed that the alternative minimum tax would be allowed to hit middle-class households, and that Congress would allow a steep drop in Medicare payments to physicians. That's the so-called doc fix. The White House baseline assumed all of the tax rates are extended, that AMT is patched, and Medicare payments are not cut. Using that baseline, the deal reduces deficits by $618 billion by allowing the income tax rate to raise to 39.6% for households making more than $450,000, and by allowing the estate tax to rise to 40% for estates of more than $5.1 million. It cuts the deficit by $22 billion due to reductions in discretionary spending and by generating immediate revenue from allowing more savers to convert retirement plans to Roth IRAs. Congress includes the savings to offset spending cuts that were set to begin in January under the sequester approved as part of the separate deal to raise the debt ceiling back in 2011. The White House also included $24 billion in health care savings to offset Medicare, the doc fix that prevents the cut in physician payments, and it gets $104 billion in interest savings from making the other revenue and cuts. The new spending in the bill for unemployment insurance cost $30 billion. So H.R. 8 not only keeps taxes low for the middle class, asks the wealthiest to pay their fair share, and helps the economy continue to grow, it also reduces the deficit by $737 billion under this more realistic scenario. Well, that's what he wrote, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm not sure how realistic that scenario is. I guess I'll leave that for you to ponder if you want to take the time. At any rate, we're going to go ahead and take a quick commercial break, and when we return, we will continue. We are back, ladies and gentlemen, to Tap Into the Truth, and we're talking about the day after the deal. Well, we've discussed some of the aspects and fallout. And let's